Welcome to Experience the Big Apple from home. Today I'm going to talk about Ellis Island. We could spend days and days and days talking about Ellis Island, and hopefully in the near future I'll do a video that's a real deep dive about the immigrant experience on Ellis Island. But for today I just want to give you an overview of Ellis Island history, so when you go to visit you are armed with knowledge. Now most people, when they think about Ellis Island, the very first word that pops into their head is immigration. That's because Ellis Island was the very first federal immigrant processing center in the United States. But we're gonna go back in time. Before Ellis Island was an immigrant processing center, it was originally known as Little Oyster Island because it had these fabulous oyster beds that came out during low tide. And then New York City was invaded by pirates. We didn't like being invaded by pirates, so we decided to publicly punish these pilfering pirates by hanging them on the island. And the island became known as Gibbets Island. I love this image in my head of these pirates swinging from the gallows at sunset. Then in 1774, a man named Samuel Ellis bought the island, and he did what any of us would do. He named it after himself. So that's how Ellis Island got the name Ellis Island. Ellis Island remained in the hands of the Ellis family until 1808, when they sold it for $10,000 to the federal government. They were going to use the island as a military fortification during the War of 1812. During the War of 1812, New York City remembered the American Revolution when the British came to New York Harbor with 32,000 troops and very quickly took over the island of Manhattan. They did not want that to happen again, so New York City decided they were going to put several new military fortifications out in New York Harbor. One of these military fortifications is actually underneath the Statue of Liberty. You have the Statue of Liberty, you have her pedestal, and that is on top of a military fortification known as Fort Wood. On Ellis Island, they opened up Fort Gibson. And if you were to visit Ellis Island, you'd be able to see some of the remains of Fort Gibson. There were so many military fortifications out in New York Harbor that the British just said, you know what? We're not going to attack. So no shots were ever fired from any of these military fortifications. And then in 1892, the federal government opened up the very first Federal Immigrant Processing Center on Ellis Island. Now, if that opened up in 1892, and it was the very first Federal Immigrant Processing Center in the United States, did we have immigrants before 1892? Yes, of course we did. We just didn't have immigration laws the same way that we have them today. We did have a few really embarrassing immigration laws, such as the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which people really don't like to talk about because it was a very unpleasant part of our immigration history. But for the most part, boats could just dock wherever they wanted to, and as long as you could get off of the boat, welcome to America. But in 1891, we set restrictions on the immigrants entering our country. And because we set these restrictions, we had to have a centralized federal immigrant processing center. So the federal government looked at the United States, they looked for the busiest port. It was the Port of New York and the Port of New Jersey, and they opened up the very first Federal Immigrant Processing Center on Ellis Island. Today, if you were to visit, you would not see the original building. The original building burnt down in 1897. The building that you see today was completed in the year 1900. The very first person to ever be processed on Ellis Island was a young Irish girl named Annie Moore. After her, over 12 million immigrants would be processed on Ellis Island. Included in these immigrants were people like Harry Houdini, Bob Hope, and a very famous chef whose food you may have eaten. His name was Hector Boiardi. He would go on to become Chef Boyardee, giving the world canned raviolis and SpaghettiOs and meatballs. In 1893, a 5-year-old Russian Jewish immigrant was processed on Ellis Island. He was fleeing religious persecution in Russia. He was fleeing the pogroms. He and his family, they were processed on Ellis Island. They came to live in New York City. And as he grew up, this young boy taught himself how to play piano. He taught himself how to compose music. And then this Russian Jewish immigrant went on to compose one of the most beautiful and one of the most patriotic songs about the United States that has ever been written. He wrote, "God bless America, land that I love. Stand beside her and guide her through the night with the light from above." It was Irving Berlin, and he wrote "God Bless America." Remember, he was also a Jewish immigrant. He went on to compose "I'm Dreaming of a White Christmas," which invented the modern-day Christmas carol here in the United States. So Christmas carols, invented by a nice Jewish boy, processed on Ellis Island. Today, there is a wonderful museum on Ellis Island. It's absolutely free to enter once you're on the island. They have wonderful exhibits there. You can wander around by yourself. You can also get a free audio guide, or you can take a free park ranger tour. I always, of course, recommend that you take a tour guide with you. They'll give you so much in-depth, specialized insight to the different exhibits. One of my favorite exhibits is Through America's Gate. It will give you the bread and butter of the immigrant experience on Ellis Island. But my favorite exhibit is actually Modern Eras of Immigration, which talks about our current immigration laws and how we got to the immigration laws that we have today. No matter where you stand on the issue of immigration, I think that you will learn something, and it's so great just to know about our immigration history. To get to Ellis Island, you have to take a boat called Statue Cruises. Statue Cruises is the only way to get to either Ellis Island or Liberty Island. And I strongly recommend that you go to their website and get a ticket ahead of time. Their website is statuecruises.com. This will save you so much time waiting in line once you get to the dock, and then you can enjoy your time touring around. Thank you so much for watching. I hope that you learned something and discovered something new to love about New York City. And as always, thank you for experiencing the Big Apple from home.